Thanks so much for inviting me to join this journey. I mean, we're in an amazing time in our evolution, and we're entering a global age. It's always been there, but we're clearly in the 21st century. We've entered a global age, and it really requires a global perspective, a global mind, a global lens. And if we look back over the 3,000 years, let's say, of our historical evolution across the planet, all of our great teachers and all of our traditions have been gravitating to a fundamental unifying force. When you are just a conscious being, consciousness gravitates to this ultimate source. And so it's very natural that all of our great traditions will try to name this fundamental unifying force that lights up our world and gives us meaning and truth and reality. And if in the Tao, early Chinese attempts, Lao Tzu called it Tao. But it's known that when you use the word for this fundamental force, the everyday language, wherever we are in our everyday lens, isn't powerful enough to handle that name. So they usually get warning labels. The Tao that is named in the ordinary way is not the Tao. Or the great Hindu seers who attempted to articulate this fundamental force, Om, the infinite force, or Brahman, we will speak of that. But the everyday ego person, the ego lens, the ego mind, right, is in a local space that has not yet matured into being able to handle a direct encounter with that unifying force. Buddha's Great Awakening, for example, when he looked into the source of human suffering, saw that we are usually in our local spaces in everyday life when we're not awakened beings. We are suffering. We're packaging and making ourselves in a local way. And Buddha's great noble truths, when he awakened and shared this with humanity, really are global truths. He noticed that when you're in this local space, in the ego space, of seeing yourself as a separate entity, which most of us start out in an early life, that we suffer in all kinds of ways. We may have money, we may have all, but but a kind of suffering of emptiness of your life. And he saw that existence, ego existence is suffering. It has a cause, which is the ego self, making yourself an ego viewer, an ego thinker. But you have a choice. That's a third noble truth. You have a choice in how you're using your mind. This has been one of the great themes, that the ultimate technology is not only the things we make, but how we're using our minds. And because we make our reality, we make our worlds with how we're using our minds. And if we use it in an ego-ish way, as a kind of ego-mental way of using your mind, you have an ego-mental world, an ego-mental self. And Buddha saw that there's a deeper space in which the space he calls it shunyata, emptiness, like the Tao, like the Om, empty because any of the marks and words that we use from the ego language can't go there. It evaporates because it's so powerful. So when you get out of the ego space, I'll give an illustration in a moment to show. It may make it easier. But when you go into, imagine going into this deeper space of connectivity, that's what Buddha saw. That this unifying field and force that all of these traditions are naming is a space of profound, dynamic interconnectivity where everything is connecting and interrelated. So it's not a linear space. It's more like a toroidal space with the infinite calculus unfolding. So Indra's net is a word that's used, a metaphor. Indra is a god, infinite. So imagine an infinite field, boundless, with infinite points, each a jewel, sparkling, and it's a center. Each is a center, so it's multi-centered, and each encodes the entire field within it. Because you can't break a piece of the infinite off and not get the infinite, right? So imagine that, and we belong there. That's who we are. If we can develop the technology of thinking to handle that, and that's what Buddha was trying to teach us, that we can go step by step. He called it the eightfold path of everyday practice to enter into fully being in the moment, which is what Aikido and all of the martial arts are teaching as well. How do you live in the moment? Well, not the moment of the ego time, which is very low-level time, but the open time in which every moment is meeting in Indra's net. That's where we flourish. That's where we thrive, when we can cross into that space and use our minds. And we can do it. And that's what Buddha was teaching. If we practice in every moment right thinking, right practice, right mindfulness, right judgment, right interpretation, the various 8 fundamental ways in which we can use our consciousness and our mind to rehabilitate. The idea of Buddha is that egoing is a habit, a stage of our development, and we can get fixed and fixated and bounded in that space, and that's a suffering. And to be a liberated being, we have to retool our mind and rehabilitate it with this journey, and so on. But this is, I'm just using 2 or 3 examples. It's across the planet. If you look at the founding of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Judaic tradition, again you hear, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one." Yahweh, the infinite spirit, the infinite force, right, the source of all, that commands that it be recognized as the ultimate and the priority, is the founding of the Judaic tradition. And it's usually seen to be one. So the Lord thy God is one. I mean, that's a classic axiom of this global lens, the global perspective. Why? It's very simple. Because the infinite cannot be multiplied. If you have another 2 infinites, then it's not infinite. So the infinite just fills and becomes a unifying force. And because it's an infinitely unifying force, not the way the ego would understand it. The ego, everyday mind, is not capable of understanding that infinite force. That's what all of our teachers are trying to. You've got to somehow let go of that in order to move into this space. And so in a way, Jesus' teaching was trying to show humanity you still haven't gotten it. You're still looking in the box. You're looking at the laws and the scripture in the box. Whereas the script of Yahweh, an infinite script, needs a different kind of calculus, a different kind of technology. So Jesus was trying to model that we humans are meant to go into that. But you've got to let go of the ego. So the kind of sayings, you've got to die to be born again, is another way of talking about that transition from one into the other. Oh, Allah, science too, is attempting to naturally get to the fundamental source, the ultimate causes, the fundamental laws and patterns. So science too is in its own vocabulary seeking to go into this unified space. So I could really just illustrate, to give a visualization. So as we look over 3,000 years of evolution on a planetary scale, it's amazing that the teachers were realizing this unifying force field that really seems to be, presiding over every moment of our life, calls our consciousness, and it's been attempted to name that. And yet, humanity, they all saw that we humans are in our evolution of using our minds, tend to get stuck or detained in a certain space that they're trying to show you, keep going, coaching us further into a more integral technology of connecting the dots and entering into a deeper encounter with reality, which can be a scary thing. I think if I draw a notation, it might help to illustrate and give us a view of this planetary development. What I said so far was that our great teachers were pointing to this deeper space. There are 2 spaces, you might say, the space in which people live in our everyday culture. I make something like a screen here. And so this is a space in which you're conscious. Everyday people are conscious, and they make their world, and philosophers have named this a space when they try to say, what is the way language works, and when we describe our world and the way we discern the different objects in our world. And they call, fancy name for that in logic is predication. We join subjects and predicates. So Socrates is wise, rain is falling, the pen is for writing, I am a man, I'm American. You make all of these concepts and ideas as we build our world. And the I that I am, the thinker, is right there with a lens that's being shaped, viewing the screen, but we tend to be at the edge. The self tends to be at the edge and not really, but yet we make ourselves in the box. Because when you say, who am I will say, I'm a man, I'm American, I'm a father, and whatever. And we have the qualities and the properties that we put into the subject, and we make everything that way. So the pen is for writing, right? And grass is green. And whatever example we use, we don't realize that this is a space. So that the early logicians and scientists and philosophers were trying to understand everyday consciousness and how our world appears. And what becomes very clear is that the self that is processing itself here, we may call it the ego self, the ego mind, it doesn't even realize it has a lens that has been shaped all its life in its culture. And in fact, we'll see that we can have multiple lenses. I can have multiple worldviews. So our worlds are made in this space. And yet, the amazing thing is that our teachers saw that there's a deeper space of reality. And that's where the infinite unifying force is. So, as I was saying before, the Tao is a name given in the Chinese classical philosophy for that infinite force, but it cannot be named here. So when Lao Tzu begins this remarkable work, the Tao Te Ching, he says the Tao that is named is not the Tao, to mark this distance and between these two dimensions. So there's a deep script of Tao that is reality itself, where everything is interconnected, and the chi energy of the universe is in the Tao, but that cannot be processed in the usual places that we live and think. Or in the Om that I mentioned before, in the Vedic Hindu tradition, that saw that the name for this ultimate fundamental reality is the infinite symbol. It usually is always seen as infinite, and we'll see why that is the case, which means boundless and unifying, and only one. That's been clearly one of the consensus in the global lens. When you begin to see the different patterns across the traditions, that this Om is infinite and it's one. And part of the reason for that is that if there were two Oms, it wouldn't be Om. It would be limited by the other. So it has to fill all of the space and be boundlessly unifying. And because it's unifying, nothing can step outside of it. So there's something very powerful and intriguing in what's going on in this deep space. Or you could use Allah in the Muslim, Muhammad, as the only true name for the infinite. Right? And so on. So you can get the picture that the different languages were naming this fundamental force in very different ways. But we did not have a common name or a common language. And over my years, I began to see the difference between these two spaces. So what I was saying earlier is Buddha was speaking from this space, a shunyata. Shunya is emptiness, radical emptiness. So this space is empty, and this space is where we make our lives and we suffer. So just to review the two spaces, and I'll try to just distinguish two different spaces. And imagine this space in which the Tao of Lao Tzu, he's picking out the deep unifying force, calling it the Tao. And at this point, let's just get a screen where most of us live, in this screen. And it's in this space. It's a space of our everyday awareness, where we have our culture and our identity and our world. We use our language in this space, and we put concepts together and make our language. We say, philosophers call this a space of predication, where we join concepts like Socrates is wise, or I am a man, or the pen is for writing, and all of the sentences we form in our everyday language is used in this space, and we have a worldview, and the I, the thinker, is right outside the box here, and we don't even realize that the thinker that we are has a lens, and many lenses, because what shows up in the space of our awareness is shaped by a lens of the consciousness thinker. And we can get very different cultures in the box, so that if I'm a Buddhist, I can talk about my Buddhist world, or if I'm a Hindu, I can speak about the Hindu reality, or if I'm Jewish, or Christian, or a scientist, or an atheist, or whatever, all of these different worlds can be in the box. And yet in this deep space here, that's marked by this line tentatively, our teachers and seers saw that this unifying force that calls our mind to its origin, whatever name we use. So in the Vedic tradition of meditating on this fundamental mysterious name of Om as a name for this infinite unifying force, and the Tao, and in the Judaic tradition with the name Yahweh, the name for the infinite force and spirit, or the infinite word, or whether you call Allah. I'm scribbling a little bit, but Allah, the one true name for the infinite. So the point I'm suggesting, or the shunyata of Buddha, who saw that the best name for this force is emptiness, radical emptiness, because he saw the danger of trying to use this language to name that. So there seems to be a dimensional space in which the everyday language that's spoken from the ego mind and the ego way of thinking cannot really process the deeper unifying language. So the many names, all of our cultures have been knowing that there's a unifying force, and we try to name it in the dialect of our languages. And what becomes very clear, if we step out of the local languages that we have and cross into what I would call the global mind, or the global perspective, into this field, this is the journey that our teachers are trying to show us. I mentioned earlier that Krishna, who speaks the voice of Om, is speaking to Arjuna, the everyday human being who is living in the space in which there's a war going on and a battle that's taking place. And so he must decide whether he should enter this battle as a warrior, or his conscience from the higher voice tells him this is not right to kill. So we're under the influence of these two fields at all times. So the voice of Krishna speaking from this space is speaking the language of Om, and he's speaking it to Arjuna, who speaks the everyday ego language. And so there's a communication barrier across this space that we're looking at. And this crossing seems to be the great journey of opening up and awakening the global mind. So Buddha, who is speaking from this space, his great awakening was precisely seeing that the space here is a place of suffering. Because when we make ourselves in this box, so to speak, in the everyday space, and all of the information that we make ourselves into our identity, we have our ID. Who am I? I'm a man. I'm American. I'm a scientist. All of the things, I'm a father. All of the information that we build and shape our identity in this space, this is a space that Buddha saw as a space of suffering. So Buddha's great awakening and the Four Noble Truths was showing that existence here is to suffer existentially. And it has a cause, which is the attachment to the ego self. And we have a choice to cross into the awakened space. So we actually have a choice whether we use this technology and continue to use language in a way that we don't realize yet. We'll talk about this in a moment. But when we're in this technology, in the box, everything gets broken and separated into pieces and fragments. So there are many different worldviews in this space. So if I'm a Christian and I believe that Christianity and Jesus is the only truth, and that's how I'm living my life, and I would not be able to communicate with someone who has a Muslim lens, who says I'm Muslim, or I'm Jewish, or I'm Hindu, or I'm a scientist, or I'm an atheist, whatever it is, our worldviews are all in that space. And there's no room for connection and dialogue. And so this becomes a very violent space. So when you're trapped in this box of ego thinking and ego language using this technology, most people don't realize that the technology itself is creating fractures and broken pieces of your life in such a way that you cannot have a whole, integral, thriving life. So the pathway that Buddha was teaching, the fourth noble truth, is our choice is to rehabilitate our minds and move into this deeper space of shunyata. And his great insight as a scientist and philosopher is that shunyata is the space where everything is profoundly interconnected and interactive. So the great idea is that when you're in the box, you become a separated entity or thing or an object. But if you cross into the deep space, and imagine what that would be like, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We're trying to develop a language to process that. You enter into profound energetic interconnectivity. And so Buddha's way and prescription of going out of the place of suffering into the place of connectivity is just one about many different journeys from this technology into that one. And in my own journey as a philosopher, you asked about the global lens. It took me years to realize that all of these different languages that are being spoken are really touching a fundamental common logic of connectivity. That when the mind crosses out of the space here, that there are two logics. There's a logic in the box, let's call it ego logic, where we're being ego-mental, and there's a logic in this space, a logic of interconnectivity. So let me clean this up and just start over and see if there's a way to... There is a space where humanity has been living here, and the attempt to move into a more awakened technology. So all of the different names that we've seen, what I began to see, Foster, is that there is a logos. I use the Greek word logos, because it's rich, and we need to be reminded that there's a profound logic in this deep space. And I found that just as a philosopher and logician, to mark symbols, to mark when we are in this space and when we are in this space, and I use single brackets, single markers, single strokes for any word. So when you are in this space, and you remember you're speaking this technology, this mind program, mark that language with single, I call it single brackets, single strokes. And when you are in this integral language that the great teachers have been teaching, whatever dialect they may be speaking, the Tao, the Om, the Allah, the Yahweh, or even science speaking of the fundamental energy of the universe, mark that space with the double brackets. It's almost like a quotation mark. And I use the word logos to indicate, and it really is logosophia. Because the logos, the old logos word from the Greek, right, had a lot of connotations of the male left brain analytical logic. Whereas when you go into the fundamental name, the global name, what I'm suggesting is that there's a global mind, a global lens that can begin to combine the many different worldviews in their common ground. And we've not had that. So the double brackets are attempting to mark explicitly for us this technology of interconnectivity, which I'm calling the space of logosophia. Logosophia, I mean, my profession is a philosopher, and Sophia is the feminine wisdom. So philosophia is loving Sophia, the feminine energy. So the logos, the infinite name, is fully, infinitely gendered, obviously, fully male, fully feminine. So when I use the word logos, please remember logosophia. And so if you use the word Tao or Om or Allah or Shunyata or energy, whatever your name, whatever culture, whatever discipline, and you're naming the fundamental unifying force, that is the logos. So it really is the space of the infinite in a way. You can begin to see the infinite space. So in a way the double brackets are curved, suggesting entering into the calculus of infinite connectivity. And this is the space that we've not been our teachers have been speaking from that space, but we have not fully understood there's a basic technology and logic of entering into that space. And here's the way to see it. When you are in the, let's call it the egoized space, the ego space, the single bracket space, any word you utter, like I, if you say I, and processed here, as we saw, where you have your identity, that I is separated. So the I is always separated from what is not I. Whenever something has its identity, it has its own unique markers within it that distinguishes it from everything else that it's not. So that's part of the fragmentation and separation that takes place in this way of thinking. So the I in the single brackets, which is, let's call it the ego I, the separated entity, whatever worldview I am in, is not the same as the I that's in the double brackets. In this space, all of the information, space and time and cause and every other word we use, and color and figure and texture and motion, they're all separated into separate pieces. But any of these words, if you could cross in the miracle transformation into this space, like time, and all of our teachers are trying to help us to understand integral time in the double brackets. Imagine what that is. Every point in this space is connected with every other point. And you've got Indra's net. Right? You've got a different, profound network of energy, of connectivity, so that anything in the double bracket space, any point, is in the infinite calculus of connectivity. So that whereas below, in this space, it is separated off into its own separate space, when it crosses into the other dimension of connectivity, something incredible begins to happen in terms of the encoded information in everything and its dynamic connectivity. It's no longer an object or a thing that's separate, but an energy field of vast interconnectivity. And everything is like that. So we can imagine certain experiments. When our great philosopher, for example, Descartes, I think he's been profoundly misunderstood because we didn't have these two dimensions clear. When he saw in the box that every belief that we can have, when he started his meditation, he said, I'm going to doubt everything I can doubt and see if there's anything I know for certain. And so he was conducting that in the screen of our everyday thinking
where we make our world, and he saw that he could be dreaming. So if he says, I am sitting and awake, it could be that he was really dreaming. So that he says, what if I'm dreaming? It might not be true. Even 2 + 2 = 4. He says, that even if in my dream, that's true. But then he says, what if there's a demon deceiving me and making me believe it's true? Which is a very classical move. The demon of doubt is because the thinker is separated from the object of thought, that there could always be a misinterpretation and a mistake. So Descartes' bold experiment is to see everything in the box could be doubted. He dropped his mind, he dropped his body, and all of these mind and body is another split, that my mind and my body are two different names that separate, and therefore I'm not mind-body connected. But I suggest that when Descartes saw that there was nothing in the box that he could trust as ultimately true, and he said, I am, he crossed into the meditative voice. This is the place of meditative intelligence, of meditative interconnectivity. So when Descartes said, I am, I exist, he broke out of this dimension into this space. And that's been profoundly misunderstood, because since we do all of our scholarship and interpretation in this, and this is the only technology we use, we tend to take that and download it into this space and say that Descartes thinks the ego is the ultimate, where in fact he was breaking the ego barrier. And the reason why the I am is so powerful is because when you enter into this dimension, this deep dimension, what was separated below comes into a meeting point. So below, consciousness, language, world are separate domains. So that thinking, speaking, and existing are separated. But when you go into the deeper integral space, thinking, being, speaking meet in a PowerPoint. So when Descartes discovered this remarkable PowerPoint, I am, by uttering I am, by speaking the word, that's who he is. He's not in the old predication space. So I'm giving you an illustration that this is a place of separation and fragmentation of information, and crossing here is where it all comes to a PowerPoint. The subject and predicate is the basic logic that has been seen in this space. So that Aristotle, for example, in the Greek tradition, saw when he developed the science of logic, the science of thinking, which is the science of everyday language and use, that we seem to have two dimensions in our everyday thinking, which he calls the logical subject, that's the S, and the predicate is the qualities or the attributes that we can affirm or deny. We can join them positively or negatively. So in a way, the science of everyday thinking, it technically is called the science of predication, where you have a predicate that indicates a quality or an attribute of some kind that belongs or does not belong to a subject, and this is the spotlight in everyday thinking. What are the subjects and things we talk about? So this is the technology of everyday information processing, the subject and the predicate. And the laws of logic in this space is that S is either P or not P. It's an either-or logic. S is or isn't P. And that's where you get the wedge of either-or. Something is going to be black or not black, right? I'm either man or not man. Whatever it is, that's a basic law of thought for this space. So I'm jumping many steps, but basically, in the box, there is a technology of information processing. So that when you look at the P, here's an example. If you had to give a list of all of the fundamental things that could be here, you would find time, you would find space, location, you would find things like color and figure and texture and motion, and you would have consciousness, and you would have body, and these are all the building blocks that you could then predicate on the thing. So first, let me explain a few more examples that might help in this transition that is so important for us in moving from this space of this technology that we're now marking. And we can see a pattern that information in this field keeps breaking into these pieces, so that whenever we have any word or concept or idea marked with a single bracket, it is a piece of information broken off. And when we are crossing into the integral space, and we're just trying to get a sense of how powerful it is to be in that point, in Indra's net, every power point is extremely, all the difference, all the separations are united in one point when you cross into that. And in effect, the Logos, the global name that I'm using for all of these names, if the Logos is the infinite word, so this is the infinite word, the word being infinite is not like the word here or language. The word here is separated, but the infinite word is integrating all reality. So that in John the Gospel, when it's in the beginning is the Logos, the beginning of the word, when the word speaks, let there be light, there is light. I'm trying to give a sense of the non-dual and the dual, and the two. So I can illustrate it with, I've been suggesting that all of our great teachers across the traditions have been teaching us how to cross from this space into that. So we've had the technologies. For example, Krishna, who is the Om Logos, the Om voice, speaking from this space, is speaking to Arjuna, as we said before. And Arjuna is the everyday ego person who is, in effect, fragmented in this space. And so Krishna, speaking from Om in a dialogue to Arjuna, helps Arjuna to understand the step-by-step transformation from the ego life into the yoga life. So yoga is in the double brackets. It's a living integral experience where the broken person becomes a whole unified mind, body, spirit, integral to the entire ecology. So that yoga technology can be seen as a step-by-step retooling of the consciousness to go from separated ego consciousness into Krishna consciousness. What is Krishna consciousness? It is a consciousness of being in deep connectivity in the Om way, where we begin to thrive and flourish. And that is yoga, the union and the communion of that life. That's where you become a full human in the yoga vocabulary. And I pointed out before that the journey of Buddha teaching the eightfold pathways of retooling our minds to enter the technology of connectivity is where we become compassionate, awakened, scientific beings touching reality as it is, not in the old place of suffering and fragmentation. So that these illustrations, and we can see Jesus too, as also teaching the crossing from having the law written in stone in the predication of space to having it being in the person itself. So that Jesus, if you write the name Jesus with the double brackets in the Logos grammar, it is extremely different than Jesus here. Because if Jesus says, I and the Father are one, in this logic, it could mean I am God in this logic. But in the logic of connectivity, each being is connected with the Logos. So to say I and the Logos are one is an axiom of this that all of the great traditions knew. So I'm giving illustrations to show that if you process the divine script in this space, it is profoundly different than in this space. And yet this is where humanity has been, downloading these wonderful teachings that are in the integral script into a broken, lower level, ego fragmenting technology that has been disastrous for the human condition. And the cumulative effect of this over the ages has led to a broken crisis world. So we need to connect the technology of how we make ourselves in our world with the state of our reality. If we're in an ego-mental world and mind, we will have an ego-mental world. So the crisis of our planet today is a crisis of consciousness, of the ultimate technology of how do we use our minds. And what I'm suggesting is that once we begin to develop the basic literacy in the Logos grammar, in the double bracket space, and we're all meant for that, and we do that spontaneously. So that I illustrate it to my students when I teach them, they begin to get this right away when I use a single bracket and the double bracket. But sometimes they feel that that's far away, the double brackets, even though they recognize it. And I remind them that we have moments constantly when we are already in the zone. I'm going to do something very radical. I'm going to put the double brackets surrounding the entire field. I know this is a bit confusing, but the double brackets it should be seen, is the Logos being the infinite force. It's infinitely surrounding the entire field. This is a very important point, because now I'm going to do something. I'm going to go to the next page and make this simpler. So let's start over, now that we have the double brackets. The infinite Logos surrounds us at all times. And wherever we mark off the space that we live, here, in the box, when I say I here, very different from I here, I help my students to see that the Logos is always operating on us. So that if you had to write your name, it would be good to write it whatever your worldview is here, but to write it with the double brackets around it. This is extremely important because, in a way, the journey of awakening as a human being is to be able to step back enough to allow this rigid identity that I've formed in my lens of my culture can be dropped for a moment, and there I am already. So the I is already always present, however our culture shapes our lens. And so the journey from here to there is really, in effect, this journey of stepping back from the rigid fixity of the ego lens. So when the runner who is running finds herself running, and I help my students see that we touch into these moments, which athletes call it being in the zone, where they're in this integrity and interconnectivity. So that since we start out, my coach is coaching me and I am running. And so I'm learning how to run, and I'm practicing running. So running is a predicate that belongs to me. And I'm trying to be a good runner. And I'm practicing my breathing and my movement of my arms and my legs and so forth. And then suddenly, 3 years later, let's say, I suddenly find myself as running. Double brackets. What is that? That is an integral experience in which my awareness, my body, and the movement are also integral in the moment, of integral time, that I experience a profound, it's a really runner's high of being in the zone of running. We have moments like that in our life. The reason is because we're always surrounded at all times in the Logos. And it's so powerful because it's the infinite force. It shows up spontaneously in high moments in our life. And what our great teachers have been teaching us is the technology of retooling our minds habitually to remain in this awakened awareness where we become a whole integral being. So this is one of, now I'm going to give an illustration of the pen. Okay, I'm ready to do that. So now that we see these two dimensions, and I'll just use this as a sign of when I'm speaking in the two, that might help. We've not had this double bracket space explicitly marked, even though we've been using it for millennia. And I'm trying to suggest that there are powerful disciplinary ways of getting literacy and training our minds to stay in that space. And humanity needs this now for our thriving and our surviving. And, but we need to do a little more homework to understand. So when I talk about this runner, right, if someone is practicing running as we typically do in our everyday experience space, let's call it the ego mental technology. Use some language about it. I see myself as I am running. My coach is telling me I should attend to my breathing and to use my arms in a certain way and raise my leg, and I'm practicing. We all do this. Whatever the activity, we process it in the ego technology. But somehow, when we have our high moments, suddenly, let's think of this runner running on the nature trail, right? 3 years now she's been running, and somehow she loses the ego. The ego is not the one that's running. She's not the, and she got us out of her way, and there's just a profound experience of running. And if you have to call it, she says, running am I. Double bracket, you need this deep language, right? Running. So running in the double brackets, I'm just trying to give a sense of the flavor of a powerful higher peak performance moment where we are so unified and integral that the language has to really match that to work. I can't explain that in the old, slow, broken, fragmenting language. It doesn't work. I need an integral language. And the double brackets is meant to be not just a marker of that language, but a transformer that helps our mind move from one mind program into the integral calculus, or the integral program. And that's where we begin to flourish, because it's amazing, Foster, because when you're in that ego mental space and separated, we're separated in all kinds of ways. We're separated within ourselves. For example, you know, an ordinary American citizen, we have multiple lenses in that box. There are multiple worldviews. And we're not educated to know that different worldviews present reality and your identity profoundly differently. If I'm a Christian, let's say, or a Jew, or whatever, and I believe in the truth of the Bible, and that's my Bible world, and my Bible self, right? And I believe God created the universe. That's one self. And let's say I'm also a physicist, I'm a scientist. And from my physics and science, which is another lens, a different world, I realize that the universe must have started with a big bang. I can't get these two together. I don't know how to. These are two me's, the religious me and the science me. And don't know how to dialogue or to talk, because we don't know how to do that often. We're not trained. So I have trouble putting those two together, but let's keep it going. I'm also an American citizen. I believe in the constitutional civic space of keeping my religion out of my politics. Difficult to do, because my religion is saying every moment of your life tend to God and to service and so forth. So it's hard to do that. So I'm confused now. I'm seeing my therapist. She's a Jungian, let's say. And the Jungian therapy says every human being has a male and female side, an anima and an animus, and you need to get it together and have those talking to each other in order to be an integral unified being in that therapy. Now I'm really getting confused, because I have to come to terms with my male and female side, right? So I'm getting really stressed in my life. And a tree-hugging friend of mine taught me to go to yoga class. So I'm going to yoga, and now I'm doing yoga, and I'm meditating on Om. I'm breathing the prana, I'm learning about karma, and I'm learning about samsara. It's a totally different world. So my yoga self is still different from all of these other ideas, right? And they're not connected. So what that means is that if we don't know how to connect our different lenses and worldviews, when we have many of them, within ourselves, then I am in multiple identities. A kind of ontological schizophrenia in a way, right? And I'm fragmented. And mind and body and all of these pieces, they're different, so that my mind pulls in one way, my body, right? So I have a mind-body issue. So I'm just trying to give illustration of how the ego technology can divide us across our lenses, across our identities, and we don't know how to integrate them. And so even within the person, to become whole and to thrive, we need to find a way to connect our worlds. And what the double bracket technology does is to get to the deep ground and source of connectivity, where these fragmented worlds in the lower dimension find their meeting point. And that's really, culture needs that desperately to survive, because of course we're a marketplace of many cultures, many worldviews. And some writers have claimed that in that space, since it's the only space we seem to have or to know for culture, our worlds are in deep collision. We get 9/11s, we get the holocausts of all kinds, and genocides of all kinds. At every level this is recurring. Within my own personal life, I'm fragmented and I'm not integral. In my relationship with my spouse or my significant other, communication breaks down. In my relationship with my children and the family structure, there are breakdowns in communication. Right? So our love life suffers, because if you try to carry out your love life in the ego mental space, and you're an object for me, my other is a thing, right? So if you say, you know, on Valentine's, you're the greatest thing that ever happened to me, that's not the language of love. The language of love is a language in which you get out of your ego identity and come into relation. So that going into the double bracket space is a deep dialogue connection with everything around you, because you're not cut off. You are essentially connected to the other. That's what it's about. That's the great teaching of being a moral being, is when I, Ashok, in this double bracket space, I'm still an individual. By the way, the word individual is important, because individual, ironically, means not divided. Individual is divided, individual is undivided. And yet in the ego space, I'm divided. I'm self-divided. I'm divided from everything else. So if I want to become individual, holistically one, and undivided, it's when I'm connected with everything else. So one of the worries that people have is, if I go into this deep, connected, unified force, would I lose my identity and melt away? Well, in a way, you lose your ego, artificial identity that you've been given, but you gain your true identity. in your unique space. That's what Indra's net holds, because the infinite space has infinite unique points, and each point is a miracle point. Well, that's exactly the point that I'm trying to bring out. In the ego identity, it's not that you kill the ego. I mean, a lot of that can be very confusing. It's when I erased or loosened up those two rigid, it's really to step back from only seeing yourself in the cultural lens of the identity and the predication self as an object. If you take that to be your ultimate true self, that's where the danger is. So that in the journey, it's not that you just, in going into the double brackets, it's not that you stop being a man or an American. All of these things hold. But you're in a deep space of an energetic interconnection. You know, that is the point. So your identity is found in the larger. But Foster is ultimately Foster, and Ashok is ultimately Ashok in the double brackets. That's really, the double brackets points out that in Indra's net, there are infinite unique points, each having its sacred, unique space. Imagine each of us is a point like that. So Foster is a point, Ashok is a point, and as I discover out of the box of the artificial constructs that I make, I discover my unique locus in relationship to you and to everything else in my environment. And that's where you begin to find your higher identity. But in the metaphor of Indra's net, it's a metaphor, and we have many ones, and I know that you, with your toroidal field and language of fractals and so forth, are the many different ways to image an infinite, boundless field of interconnectivity. The infinite field, this is what most people don't seem to get. It took me years to get this, and it was an eye-opener, mind-opener, life-changing, because if you think of the infinite unified force, it seems to be the infinite force would be so profound it would wipe out all diversity and difference. Then you have just a blank screen. And if that's Brahman, if that's the name for the Hindu word, then to cross into that field is to blow away all your differentiation and uniqueness. And that's a scary thing. Whereas, in fact, the infinite force has infinite diversity in it. That's Indra's net. That's why you get nodes, infinite nodes, each a jewel, and each jewel encodes the entire field. We can illustrate it with a pen. If you take this pen and you put it in the ego space with the single brackets around it, what is it? It's just a piece of plastic. It's for writing. You give the ego information, right? And it's a disposable pen. You throw it away. But imagine something, nothing short of a miracle. Imagine taking this pen and putting it in the double bracket space. Do a thought experiment. What does that mean? It means as you find the true information in the pen put into the higher calculus, it is interconnected with the entire universe and all evolution. And in a way, that's true. The information energy encoded in the pen tells a story of the entire field. That's the power of Indra's net. Right? So each of us, imagine Foster, is spoken in that double bracket space, not just in the ego space. Suddenly Foster is encoding the entire evolution in a unique, miraculous way. And in a way we know that's true. You're carrying all of that information all through the cosmos. That's who we are. So it's not that you cease to be Foster, you become Foster. So that's really what the journey is. And all of our teachers understood, great teachers understood that. I don't mean teachers in the schools. That's what we need to see. Our teachers in the schools need to really be educated into the literacy of this educational heritage. But I mean, when I say the teachers, I mean the great teachers of all of our traditions. And I mean men and women. You know, the feminine wisdom that is in this Logosophia field, you know, of experienced interconnectivity, understood that. That's an exciting prospect because that's where it really belongs. So let's imagine at the core that we've talked about this ego mental space that humanity seems to be really stuck in so many ways, where the ego or the ego mental mind, where in the box, so to speak, what we call predication, that technology, where we have our worldviews. I'm a Jew, I'm a Christian, I'm a scientist, I'm an atheist, whatever it may be. I'm pro-life, I'm pro-choice, Big Bang, all of these worldviews are being played out in that screen, and they don't have room to meet and connect in any real dialogue. Violence happens. The self that's made in this box, this ego self, feel separated and isolated and impotent and overpowered and overwhelmed, not to be able to transform her world often. And we're in fragments and fragmented and polarized. All of that's going on in this core space. But we've seen that this is already surrounded by what we call the logos, the double brackets, the field of deep interconnectivity, the infinite field, where everything is deep in the space of this logos that we're talking about. And now we also saw that we are always surrounded in this space. That's where we're now in the middle. You and I are now in a deep dialogue connection. And I'm not separated and cut off from you, but you and I are interactive. Everyone is. All events are. And the individuality of Foster, the individuality of Ashok, begins to blossom in a boundless, open-ended dialogue dance. And this is where I begin to flourish and come into myself. This is where ethics happens, because there can be compassion. I see myself in you and you in me. And whether it was Jesus or Buddha or Kant or all of our great teachers were teaching that ethics is when you can treat the other as yourself. That's the dialogue space, interconnectivity. You can't get that in the ego-mental space. We're just cut off and too isolated. So that would be my sense of translating it into this dynamic, toroidal, dance. That's very exciting because I think it's meant to be seen in that way, not just on a flat surface. So let's imagine together the space that we talked about, that space, that ego-mental space, the ego-mind, that now it turns out to be artificial separation because we're surrounded by connectivity, but this is a place in which it seems that human beings have been laboring and trapped in our cultures, our worldviews, our disciplines, our education, our relationships in this so-called egocentric box. Our worlds, whether I'm a Jew or a scientist or an atheist, whatever it may be, all of these worldviews are processed in that same space, and there's not room for connection and interconnectivity. So there's a lot of violence and disconnection, and relations break down. Love can't work, ethics can't work, reason can't work, science can't work, knowledge can't work because of the artificial separations. And what we've seen before is that, of course, this was always already surrounded in the logos, what we call the double bracket technology, the one that tries to capture the deep interconnectivity of the logos, or whatever name you use for it, the space where everything is interconnected, the dynamic toroidal space, the dynamic space of Indra's net, whatever metaphor you use. And this is a space in which we become fully human and realize our interconnectivity. But of course, we've all seen that we ourselves, right here, you and I, and all of us, are always already in this field. And that means that you and I are not separate objects, but subjects meeting in an open space of interconnectivity. We are interconnected. This is where I find my individuality and connectivity and unique, and you as well. Each person holds a miracle spot in this space. This is where dialogue takes place in ethics and compassion and knowledge. If I want to know who Foster is, I can't prejudge you. I have to open up to you. This is the space that science, ethics, reason, all of the human arts begins to open up. So it's a humanizing space. And this is where science has to go to really study the other, not as an object in the box, but as an open field of interconnected. That's a unified field.
Right.
This is very exciting to try and do this experiment because I think this is what will really bring it out. So imagine the core space that we've been talking about, the space that we call the ego-mental technology of thinking, the ego-mental mind that separates itself and objectifies in the screen that we're holding up, of where we process our experience and our life and our worlds. And remember, all of our worldviews are in this space, all of our identities, and we ourselves are manufactured in that space. We feel lonely and isolated and often impotent. We don't have the power to transform our world, so we're locked in. And our different worldviews compete for that space, for dominance. And so there's a lot of violence, chronic violence, and breakdown of relationships. We can't be whole, knowing, scientific, moral, rational, democratic beings in that closed space. And that's really been the net summation of all of our global wisdom. And of course, we've seen that this is already surrounded in the logos, in the double bracket technology, the space of deep interconnectivity, of infinite boundless, Indra's net, the logosphere, whatever name, with a holistic field of deep interconnectivity where there are no more separated objects, but dynamic, toroidal, interconnected, fractal fields of energy. That's already a deep and powerful, and that's where we're suggesting that humanity must move and expand and mature for survival and thriving. But of course, we've seen that we are already always surrounded. We ourselves, right here, right now, always in this logosphere, or this field of interconnectivity. So that you and I, in our conversation, our dialogue, are not separate objects cut off, but dynamic, interconnected fields. So Foster holds a space, a miraculous, unique space of individuality, as does Ashok. Each of us holds that in Indra's net, and each of us a center, encoding the entire field of the logosphere, reflecting it uniquely in our PowerPoint. And this is where knowledge and science and compassion and human relations and love all can take place. And this has been the cumulative teaching of all of our teachings for the centuries. But we have not yet matured into the literacy of this language of logos. And this is really where I think we must go. Yes, and again, we have the resource of our teachings that have looked at this for centuries, so it's not just a new thing. Once we make the link that how we're using our minds creates our world, and that if I'm going to ego lens, if I'm going to use an ego and separate myself off and then look at the others as objects, there's a profound kind of violence already taking place in that mental act of egoing, because I've broken the circuits of interconnectivity. I have disconnected myself, disconnected you, you become an object, and I see you through my lens. So if I'm a practicing Christian and I believe Jesus is the truth and the only truth, and you are an alien to me, then there's going to already be, because I'm taking you through my lens. It'll be very different if I saw you through your lens. But that's, again, the double bracket, the dance of interconnectivity. So imagine then what happens when I make myself an object, I make you an object, I make nature an object, what naturally follows? Because you're in a box, and you become a tool, an object, right? And that's not where love, you can't have a love, you can't be in love with an object or a thing, but with a person, right? So that already shows that real love is not happening in that space. So when you have the objectification, and then compounded by different worldviews, so my lens and my worldview, which is different from yours, and yours is alien. I have the truth, you don't. That's a very dangerous, explosive situation. That's when you get 9/11s, that's when you get ethnic cleansing, that's when you get the horrific Holocausts, that's when you have bombs going off. I am pro-life, you're pro-choice. I can't compromise my lens, because pro-choice, I'll die for that. And pro-life, you're going to die for that. You think that taking a life, there's no negotiation. So bombs are going to go off, breakdown, no communication. That's the nature of the space we live in our political world. And imagine America, for example, as a multicultural, multi-lens society, which we celebrate the diversity, which is right. The Afrocentric views and the Asian views, the Latino views, and all the many different people that we treasure, the native indigenous views, they're all different lenses. But if we're not talking, where is the democracy? Democracy is power to the people, we the people. And if we're not we, if I can't even be a me, and we can't be a we, then we do not have the power to the people. And so there's going to be power plays and power votings and groups and cults forming to overpower the next, and there's no real democracy. And this is exactly where what we call the interconnected technology where dialogue takes place, which respects diversity. So if I can go through a dialogue with you, imagine this. I am pro-choice, and I really believe in choice, and you're pro-life, and we go into the deeper place. We're not just blocked in each other. Then perhaps my language will begin to shift from the single bracket into this deeper, from choice to choice. And when I do that, I begin to see that the unborn fetus may have a choice. And if I'm committed to choice, then how about that choice, right? And you would see life, as that expands, then life is choice. So if you're committed to life, and life is as precious as freedom and choice, you begin to meet in a deeper place. And so again, in that interconnectivity of a deep dialogue, you begin to find your common ground. And that's when you begin to enter into real communication. That's where democracy is going to work. Well, again, it's a great question, because if you're in the ego sphere, right, ego money, I speak of egonomics, right, where again we know that, in terms of money and capital and investments and profit and the bottom line, it's a whole mentality that governs the marketplace. But of course, money, if you took money and put it into the double bracket space, and of course all money comes out, everything, all energy comes out of this So that's the money, the funding of logos, the energy, right? It's a different kind of money. Human resources are very valuable. You go through a different value system. You can speak of logonomics, the higher economics. And businesses now, advanced CEOs are beginning to see that not just the bottom line of profit, but thinking of the workers and the stakeholders and the larger ecology and tending to doing your business in a way that's friendly to that kind of consciousness is beginning to move in that direction. You get a different kind of use of money and then a redistribution of the gross disparity and injustice that we have. Because when you live from the compassion, Jesus, for example, said, when I was starving, you tended to me. When I was in prison, you visited me, right? When I was without money, you helped me. That's the compassion, so that the money will become redistributed as a consciousness shifts into an economy of compassion rather than an economy of objectification. Well, again, our teachings have shown us for eons that you cannot thrive and be a healthy, integral human being when you're a broken being by severing yourself from the life source. If the life source is connectivity, literally, and you're cutting yourself off from that with the ego lens, you're going to literally starve and decay and perish. And you're going to be broken in all kinds of pieces in your multiple identities, your body, your mind, your spirit. So right now, in terms of holistic health and the revolution in culture of integral medicine, to realize that acupuncture and Ayurvedic and scientific medicine, allopathic, all have their powerful contributions, but we don't know how to bring those worlds together. So mind-body medicine is not in the box it's attempting to find that meeting point of mind-body, one concept in which the energy flow between consciousness and body and matter is found to be continuous. That begins to get into integral, unifying health. And sciences like yoga and acupuncture and all of these have been trying to get into that chi energy, right, of alignment. So that becomes, again, an analog between being unhealthy and having well-being. Well, again, this is one of the amazing evolutions in our culture. Science is wonderful. Science has been a great, miraculous breakthrough in epistemology. It took centuries of refining and critical thinking to arrive at a new, higher form of dialogue. And so in a way, that's what science is about. The method is having to do with the technology, improving the technology of discovering what's out there, what's the facts around us. And it really has to do with moving towards this interconnectivity and breaking out of a rigid lens. That's the beauty of science and the virtue of science. So it's in the right trajectory. But alas, science too has its lens, its theoretical structure, and its habits. And it can put the object of study in the box, including the human being, including consciousness, whatever, and often lose sight of what's been most glorious about science, which is self-consciousness about its method of thinking. And when it sleeps on that and has its lens and forgets that, and just looks at the object in a box, you can violate the object and undermine the best interests of science. So I think the greatest step for this higher integral technology of processing the unified field of reality is science is in quest of being in touch with the true facts and with reality. And the lens, as it begins to dilate, the lens for all culture but of science as well, the dialogue dance intensifies. As I said, you and I can be in a deeper dialogue. If I want to know who Foster is and I don't put you in a box, now I can go into deeper process. So that's been the greatness of science. So the next stage in the quantum advance of scientific method is the full maturation of this lens opening, which comes with exploring phenomena, asking questions, revising, and the willingness to revise our conceptual lens. So now things like the butterfly effect or non-locality and seeing the deeper laws of energy and superluminary velocities and all of the things at the frontier of science that are being discussed, it's forcing the lens to dilate in this precise way to process the unified field. That's a great question. And again, we now realize, and many people see this, when you use the word spirituality, understood in this integral technology, that's what spirituality is. Spirituality is not religion. In the box, where our religions have tended to be, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of the religions, East and West, it's not a Western thing. When you use the ego lens, you get an ego religion, an ideology, a belief system, a cultic kind of dogmatism that's closed in the box.
And yet the script, the infinite force, has been always calling us to this higher technology. So I see spirituality as just what we talked about science, the capacity to enter into deep connectivity. So it really is, spirituality in that sense is a technology of being a fully mature rational being who can experience, and that's what science is. So there's no incompatibility between global lens, global spirituality, global consciousness, and global science. So in that sense, when you see that, and that's where there's deep dialogue with nature, interconnectivity, let's take some examples, hard examples. For example, if you look at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we all know they come from the same biblical source. They're children of Abraham. They are religions of the book. And yet looking over 2,000 years of abysmal violence in the name of religion, crusades, and all kinds of holocausts and to one another. And of course today, the breakdown in the battles of religions, of Christianity understood that way, or Judaism, or Islam. And of course, the higher minds of these traditions touched into this field, whether it's in Kabbalah, to see the missing script, the deeper script of interconnectivity, or the Christian mystics, or the Quaker tradition that understood community to get out religion out of the box, and the Sufi, great Sufi traditions that understood the global power of Islam, which means surrender to Allah, has nothing to do with violence in that way. So when you're in the box, your religion becomes a violent potential. So imagine a dialogue between Judaism, Christianity, Islam, for example, that allege to come out of the same biblical source, the same God. How can you put those together if the script of Yahweh, Allah, Christ, is a script of interconnectivity, and when it's separated here, there's going to be the violence. So the pathways of dialogue, and they're happening now on the planet, interreligious dialogue, interfaith connections, to see we come from the same source. So if I can take Jesus out of the box and realize that Jesus, in fact, was modeling this shift, the double bracket Jesus, the global Jesus, the Jesus that is the Logos in the flesh, that's a very different Christianity than the separate ego-mental or fundamentalist Christian, Islam, Judaism. So imagine that all my life, I've been raised in a more ego-mental Jesus, and Jesus now in the box, and I never realized it, and now I became aware that when I objectify the teaching and the scripture and read it in that space, and that there's an option, it's a different one. If I can begin to hear Jesus and read the Gospels in the literacy of the double bracket grammar or technology, and begin to, in fact, see that now Jesus' words make more sense than ever. When he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, you can't process that properly. How can a person be the truth? A truth is a sentence that refers to something outside a fact. To be the truth, to be the way, to be the life, you're in this deeper integral space. And all of the rituals performed by Jesus, making the blind to see, saying, unless you die, you can't be born again. You begin to hear those words in a deeper way, and the double bracket Jesus becomes real. When that happens, and you realize that moral teaching of seeing yourself in the other, and to see that when Jesus says, don't cast the first stone, all of the things he modeled begin to ring true, and you begin to realize, this other person, this Muslim, that was so alien to me, I begin to see as my brother. I'll visit his mosque, as Jesus visited the houses of the unclean, so to speak. So that would be an example of how it would feel. And you would get deeper compassion for the other people that before in the box you saw as objects, alien and distant. In the further, prior. So that when the other, the point is that when you saw the other in the box as an object, and therefore in a violent mode, when you open up into the dialogue mode, then what was estranged and an alien other becomes now one's brother or sister, and of the same flesh, of the same logos. So it cannot be stressed enough what a shift in your whole being and experience of the other comes in going from seeing the other in the box and to seeing the other as an other, when I describe this move into this space of interconnectivity for all beings. Well, if I were able in this integral space to understand what Islam means, and to read the Quran, and to understand that Allah is a wonderful expression of the Logos, right? And not to make them the same. I'm not saying that Jesus and Muhammad
are the same, or that Abraham and Jesus and Moses are the same. Not at all, because of the diversity. Each is unique. Each is a unique historical miracle happening. So there's diversity, but they still come from the same fundamental logos. There's no getting around that in terms of the infinite source. That completely shifts. And the other now becomes an augmentation to me. I can begin to see a deeper understanding of the logos, my logos, through the eyes of the other. So rather than the other becoming a threat that diminishes mine, it becomes almost another eye to help me see more deeply. Science can do that. Other religions can do that. Indigenous peoples can do that. And each person now becomes like the eyes open up of Indra's net. So I am augmented by the other. That's a deep shift. Okay. Education would be totally different if placed in the sacred space of interconnectivity. Because imagine, our children are sacred beings, naturally. They are not objects. And if you put the child in the object space and treat information in the predication mode, and to instill the mountains of information into the child as an object, that model of education is a violent model that preempts the child from realizing her full logos nature. And creative teachers like Montessori and the Waldorf school, which start with the premise that the child is a sacred being, and to create an appropriate space to nourish and nurture that child. That's really what I've been working on in terms of the deep dialogue education. What that look at, it's a very different humane space that allows the natural, unique, individual gifts of each miracle child to flourish in a non-violent environment where you don't force them into rigid boxes. And there's a lot of that kind of violence in the current educational practices. Well, that's a great question. It's been quite a journey for me. I mean, over these 40 years or 45 years of having a deep intuition fostered that there's a unified connection of rationality. But everything in my studies showed me fragmentation, even logic, the science of consciousness. When I began and wrote my doctoral dissertation, 40 years ago, I was trying to find an integral logic, and I studied the Aristotelian logic that shaped, the model that shaped our European mind, and the modern mathematical logics of Frege and Wittgenstein and Russell, and trying to find the power of these two instruments for understanding. I didn't have the words for it, which we now call interconnectivity, the unified field of language and thought. And I found fragmentation and polarization. The Aristotle paradigm repelled the other one, and then you have to just choose and drop one or the other, and I refused. I kept both. And my question was, how do you connect them? And it was only when I went east into Indian philosophy for the first time, after my doctoral dissertation, that I began to discover the transformations of meditative awakening and awareness and these other traditions that for the first time made me aware of the technology of my thinking. All my education, no one, even though we're concerned with critical thinking, the lens issue, what kind of mind, so ego-mental thinking was not even on my map. It's the meditative turn into the unified field of these other traditions that woke me up to that. And so then I began for 35, 40 years to trace that, to say there must be a fundamental logic, a missing logic. The more I went across these cultures, I saw that they spoke differently, but I began to hear resonances of fundamental laws and dynamics in what I now use the double brackets for. It took me years of teaching to learn, because I was at first teaching everything in the single bracket space. I didn't even call it that. That was just what we had. So I would teach Krishna here or Buddha here, and it wasn't working, because their essential teaching was you've got to realize there's a box and move out of it. So I had no choice but to invent spaces. And that led, after 20 years, to the double bracket and the single bracket distinction, which changed my life. And so I now feel that philosophy is moving to a global lens, a global philosophy. We've never had a truly global philosophy that will be rich enough to not just be East or West or indigenous or whatever, but a rich enough grammar to accommodate the multiplicity of our worldviews. And that's really the focus of my work. Yes, bringing my philosophy as it matured, and I began to see this more and more, and I brought it out into my collegial life, not only in the college environment, but the wider academy. I felt a very strong, threatened backlash, because I was questioning the deepest level, not only of academic life and academic philosophy, but personal worldviews. To the extent that people are critically or uncritically living in the ego-mental space, that's their identity, that's their life. You begin to question that and to suggest that all of our great teachers of the traditions are trying to show us a way out, that's hits the deepest nerves. So naturally there's going to be backlash and resistance and denial and suppression and all of those dynamics. And I've had to live with those for years. But knowing that there is no way other than to hold the space for this, because it's very clear, and I think many colleagues on the planet now see, that the shift to global consciousness is absolutely vital if we're going to survive. And if we want our grandchildren to have a world, we really have to speak out on this. Foster, it's not surprising that there will be this backlash, because people who are feeling threatened by these innovative, it's always been the case all through history, as we know. When Socrates was asking radical questions, he got hemlock. Right? When Jesus was alleging that there was a higher way to be, he got his form of hemlock. Right? So the cocktail is all around. And it's not surprising, because the predominant current regime or paradigm is a regime in the ego-mental space. It is a power structure. And those who are outside or appear to be outside of that box, that particular grammar, are dismissed and discredited. They're not saying, they're not acknowledged as being the innovators of new cultures. There's something that seems to, they're put down and discredited. And again, in terms of the pattern of violence, when you objectify the other and the voice of the other, it's very easy to do that. That's been at the heart of violence. So there's a kind of interpretive violence that goes on. It's not seen as such. That's part of the trouble. From the outside, yes, I'll start over. The reason why there's such a threatened feeling towards the other, and I'm not going to say more, because that's exactly a good illustration. You, Foster, or someone from the outside might say, why would X be threatened by what would appear to be an expansive, more inclusive progress? But the person in question doesn't see that other that way. They see it from the start as an untrustworthy, not worthy of hearing, can't be right, and so forth. This has been happening all through history. There's a reason for it. Because again, in terms of ego identity, the ego-mental identity, when you question a paradigm, even as deeply as itself is the ultimate technology of mind that gives you identity, it is your life in some way. You are your paradigm. That's why people go to commit suicide bombings for their ideology, because it's tied to their identity and to their form of life. And when that comes under question, it's not a light issue, and people defend their identity. So it's a question of one's own deepest meaning, structure, and identity, and one's very being that's under question. It's not just in-the-box stuff that you can keep at a distance. And I think that's very much at the heart both of the psychological backlash as well as the institutional, cultural resistance to it. It's quite reasonable for people to both see the sense it makes to be integral, but then feel demoralized or discouraged about how to get there. And I hear this all the time. It comes up in my teaching with my students as they begin to encounter the texts of Buddha, Krishna, and the various teachers that have taught this awakening. They typically ask, I see it, but how can I do that? Can we really do that? And I try to remind them that all of our great teachings on the planet have developed strategies for daily practice to rehabilitate the mind from the ego habit, and to realize it's a habit, it's a choice. And just like kicking any habit, and rehabilitating the minds to new patterns, which has always been the pathway of moral life, from vice to virtue. Virtue is being a virtuoso in acting well, and vice would be attachments to literally to vice. So to rehabilitate the mind, all of the practices of yoga, for example, or the rituals taught by Jesus, all of Zen philosophy, helping the student to learn how to be in the moment, all the martial arts, training to help the person become habitually recentered in who they are, right? We have all of those, but I think just everyday people in the walk of life, once they begin to get this, can develop their own practices, because it's in a way it's simple. It's saying, don't fall asleep on the job. Don't go back into ego. Pay attention. Wake up. And every act you perform can be done in a mindful way. You can walk to work, in a way that I'm going to pay attention. You can breathe. All of yoga is pay attention to your breath. We completely forget that when you're breathing in logos, prana, right? If you just follow your breath, that's one exercise. Or just sitting, zazen, is a zen, the meditation of sitting. If you can just learn to sit, any one act can begin to help recenter your whole life in that. So I think all around us, when we do our workouts, our jogging, our yoga, whatever it is, walking, eating, food, do you eat ego food or do you want to eat whole food? See? Again, the rituals of eating in all of our religions, when you break bread. So, for example, when Jesus says, from now on, when you break bread, eat this, and it transmutes. Imagine doing this in every act in your life. Paying attention when you're in relationship. Pay attention and be present to the other. So when we practice this as a lifestyle, we begin to become more mindful in the moment and we recenter in it. So there are all kinds of ways of doing this. And to access the space of interconnectedness, to remember that we have all kinds of teachings and pathways that have been prescribed for centuries, millennia, that have been well worn and tested, that are available. For example, yoga, the martial arts, Zen meditation, etc., etc. So the ritual practices of our religion, eating rituals and so forth. Rituals are very important. But breaking out of all of that, every individual can design, prescribe her own pathways in simply remembering that to enter into connectivity, one has to enter into now time, double bracket time, boundless interconnected time. Just if you focus on that alone, to be mindful in the now moment, and to know that everything that you're doing could be a practice. Even your breathing, even your posture, and your sitting, and every act you make, walking, conversations with your friends, your meals, you're making coffee, you're going to sleep, everything whatsoever can be done in a mindful, ritual way. And if you realize that, and you realize that it can be fun to be practicing mindfulness because you are alive and becoming whole, it becomes profoundly accessible. Well, our world situation now is clearly, we know the crises around us. It's been well articulated and it's in our face. And I think humanity is beginning to understand that we're almost in a do-or-die situation, a tipping point with all of the trends. I don't have to mention them, in terms of the global warming and the devastation to the ecology and the economic disparities and all of them, many, many forms. But what is important from my point of view, and the point of view of many different wisdom keepers on the planet who see the collective wisdom of the centuries and the millennia, it's no big secret. You get two stories going on, Foster. You get a more narrow one. If you look at the world situation from the ego lens, you get one demoralizing, scary, dejecting, that creates despair and impotence to see the state of the world. But by going into the global lens, you can have a more joyous understanding, point one, because you realize that the state of the world is the cumulative effect of millennia of malpractice of ego minding. And what we have today in the crisis is the effects, the cumulative effects of centuries and centuries of egoing, of ego mental practice. But at the same time, what's been usually suppressed and not as evident is the logos forces, the logos teachers, the logos humans have been working and struggling, and that has been growing and has come to a point now where there's a profound drama on the planet of the awakening citizens around the world, and the masses of people are ready to see that we have to go into this interconnected, compassionate, mutually caring space. I have deep trust in the people, and that's happening. It's not just elite wisdom people, it's everyday people. It's beginning to happen. That's happening too. Although the headlines would usually show the negative news, there is fantastic good news happening. And I think many, many people feel that we're at the cusp of an incredible shift in the human condition. And the wisdom keepers I'm working with around the world recognize that the shift in consciousness from the ego mind to this global lens of compassion and interconnectivity is the most powerful transformer to deal with the crises on the planet. Why? Because the effects that we have come from our minds. Back to the point about the technology of mind. The ultimate human technology It's a technology of our consciousness. If we use our consciousness in an ego-mental way, we get an ego-mental world. If we use it in a compassionate, integral way, we get an interconnected world of compassion. So that is a tremendous empowerment where individuals can find they can make a difference to the world. So those would be the two stories, the two narratives playing out. Well, again, the precise point of what we said is that what you do comes from your understanding and your consciousness, right? And you can't just say, let's not, let's just do something about it. Doing comes from consciousness. And the most powerful ways to respond to the crisis of the question of food and disparity and all of that is to do it in compassionate consciousness. And that's what we were talking about. Well, this has everything to do with love, or we use the word compassion. If you look in the ego-mental space between objects, I've been suggesting that ego love is not true love. True love is when you are experiencing your deep interconnectivity in your being with the other. When Ashok and Foster are connected in an I-thou interconnective presence, then compassion. So compassion is not an ego feeling. It is an energetic connection between myself. When I experience interconnectivity, I can't harm you. I feed the poor. Back to I take care of the disparity I take care of the hunger. I take care of the rainforest. I take care of other species. I take care of suffering people. You see, that flows naturally from compassion and love. So when our great traditions would say, quite literally, God is love, translated into our language, logos, the logosphere, is held together in love energy. Energy and love is life. Those are literal truths of science. Interconnectivity and harmony is love. And when we have the technology to surf the interconnectivity, we are in love. But that's when we're in knowledge, and that's when we're in compassion and care. I think the minimum move now for humanity in the story of this global lens is that for millennia, there's been a birthing of humanity, which comes with the awakening of our consciousness. And what's driving that is the pull of logos, the logosphere, the infinite force.
Let me stop you.
Ready to start? Given the state of our world and the crisis and the opportunity of this moment, I think the minimal condition to move towards a sustainable humanity, thriving, flourishing, surviving, is the shift in consciousness. It really sums up to that. That's a collective wisdom. That if we continue in our ego-mental habits and do not respond to the crisis, there is no hope for us to really effectively overcome the crises and move into our true state as human beings, as interconnected beings. And that is a shift of consciousness. And it's time. What's exciting about this moment is that evolution is calling us, do or die, it's always this way, survive or awaken or perish in some way. And that's what's the great hope, is that the Logos is the presiding force, and we're going to do it. Well, to sum this up, this journey of humanity in the Great Awakening, it really comes down to recognizing that ego minding is a stage of our evolution, and that to become a full, flourishing, integral human being, we need to mature to our global lens of being able to handle multiple perspectives and worlds in a non-violent and compassionate way. And that's when we become truly human. If I had to sum up very succinctly the core of this philosophy to the global lens, it would be that to recognize and come to awareness that in the single brackets, it's marking a technology of thinking and using our minds that has devastating consequences to my life and our life, and that we have a choice, and that we have precise, doable ways of crossing into and rehabilitating our minds into an integral technology of using our consciousness, the ultimate technology of all, that brings wholeness to the individual, well-being, individually and collectively. This is a very exciting moment in our evolution. And it's clear that we're surrounded by all kinds of grave dangers. But there's every reason to hope. Because when we realize and step back in our global lens, our global perspective, we can see the deep patterns that we couldn't see before
that the great teachers of all our traditions are risen in consensus that we make our worlds with our minds. We are as we mind. And if we just have one understanding of the power of our consciousness to make our world and to make that link and see that the realities we live has something to do with how we're using our consciousness and that we have a choice and that we move out of a fragmenting, polarizing mode of thinking that objectifies ourselves and others and cross into an integral, holistic, dialogue way of being a human. When we really become human, that is the ultimate lesson on the human scale and the next step in our evolution. And this is where the fundamental unifying force of the Logos is taking us all. And it's presiding. So there's every reason to hope and not to despair, because we have the power, each of us. And the ultimate message is when we take responsibility for how we're using our minds and proceed to personally shift into this integral way of being, both from our personal lives and our collective lives will shift to a thriving, surviving humanity in a new global civilization. These are exciting times that we're living in. They're also dangerous times, and we all know that. And our world is at risk. We don't have to keep repeating that point. But there's every reason for hope, because there's a great wisdom tradition across our planet that points in one direction, that we make our worlds with how we use our minds. And we've been taught that if we use our minds in egocentric ways that divide and polarize and leads to violence and disintegration, we're not going to make it. But we have a choice, and we can now cross into integral, holistic, dialogue ways of being true human beings. And there's every reason for hope. These are very exciting times. There's also great danger all around us, and we know that. But there's every reason for hope, because our great wisdom traditions are very clear that we humans make our worlds with how we use our minds, and we have a choice. And if we use our minds in egocentric ways that divide and separate and polarize and ultimately lead to violence, we know we'll not be able to make this together. But all of our evolution has brought us to an incredible moment where we can cross into integral, dialogic, holistic ways where we can thrive more than survive and have a sustainable global civilization. Every reason for hope.